Hello and welcome to this B1 Usability Package e-learning session. My name is Rasmus Jensen and the topic of this session is B1 time task, where we'll be looking into the initial configurations needed before you can make your first task. The main two things we have in B1 time task is the tasks and the registrations, which essentially ends up in billing. But before we can work on these, we need some initial setups of different sub-data items that we need to in order to set up our first task and our first registration. First of these are that we need SAP users, every people needing to register the hours need to have a SAP user. It's not required to have a professional or specific user, only an add-on user is enough, so you don't need to have additional licenses as such. Second, we need to tell each employee how they actually work in their worksheet week. This is just the amount of hours they have on each day, and we'll look into that later on in Sub-Business 1. Then we need to create our employees in SAP and link them up to the worksheet week and the sub user, and essentially after that we can use them in the task and the registrations. Our fourth item is adding task statuses. There are some default task status on how a task reacts, but you can add more or manipulate the ones that's already there. Optionally, we need some task types for categorization of tasks. And finally, we have the option to set some defaults on how a task should look like. I will now go to Sub-Business 1, showing you the different configurations we need to do in order to be able to make our first task. So here I am in Business 1, and the first thing we need to set up is the user. So we go to Administration, Set up General Users. So it's just normal SAP users. In my case, I'm using the manager. As I mentioned, the license in my case is a professional license, but an SAP add-ons license is enough, and you can see you have endless of those, so no need for additional licenses. Next up is the worksheet week, before we can actually make our first employee. So we need to go to Add-ons, Usability Package, Module Configuration, Time Task, and Standard Work Weeks. As default, there will be a standard work week with some default hours. You can either change that, or if you have multiple employees having different work hours during the day, you can set up multiple of these by simply going up and adding a new one. We are now ready to set our first employee. So it's the normal SAP employee, master data. Go to add mode and type in my name. I can fill out all the different fields I need to, but the only mandatory is the first name and the last name. And under B1 time task, I need to tell up which worksheet template I have, and I have the standard. Also, in order to tell that I'm manager and that relates to this user, I need to go in and say user code equals manager. So adding me, I have now been hooked up as an employee that is able to work with B1 time task. Having set up the employee master data, we now only need to set up the additional data for the task before we can begin working with B1 time task. The first thing is task status, which we take from user-defined windows and find the task status down here. As you can see, we have 4 default task statuses in there, but you can add more or manipulate the names of the already existing ones. We have a closed, we have an open, ready for billing, we have an open, not ready for billing, we have a planned, and ready for new ones. Each task status have some options on how they affect the tasks and what we can do with them. So closed, we cannot register hours, we cannot build them, and the task is not editable, equal it's dimmed out. Open ready for billing, we can do everything, while open not ready for billing is where we can register time, but we cannot bill it yet. And finally we have the planned, where we can go in and it's editable, but no one outside the one actually working with the task can actually work with it. You can, of course, manipulate this if you want to. The default of a task will come later on, but you can make more setups as you feel like it. Next up, we'll set up the task types. We go to Administration, Add-ons, Usability Package, Module Configuration, Time Task, and set up task types. Right now I have 2 types, one called big projects, one called small projects, but you can make any kind of categorization you want. Let's make a medium projects. And I now have 3 task types, which I can use to group the different tasks later on when we create our first task. The final thing we need to do before we can actually begin making our very first task is we need to see what defaults we want to have in the system. There are defaults for task, time registrations, and billing. For the task, we have the different defaults of billing format, connection type, profit center project, and so on. The terms right now are unknown to you, but when we make our first task, every single type of these information will be explained to you, and you can afterwards come back to this window and set up the defaults as you want to. Because this is simply just saying every time you create a new task, this should be the default. For time registrations, we have the option to either have that all time registrations are automatically approved or not. And for the billing, we have the option to say what is our billing target type. Do we want to create invoices or deliveries? And do we want to have it default being a draft or not? So you can set up your defaults, and that will kick in after when you begin making your task and registrations. So in summary, this was the 6 different additional data we need to set up before we can actually make our first task, which we will do in the next e-learning session. This concludes this session. For training material, please go to service.boyum-it.com/education, or if you want a free demo of the product, go to license.boyum-it.com/b1up. If you want to contact us, you can do it either by our sales email or our support email. Thank you for attending.